into respiration, which is the next topic for today. So I assume all of you know the main organ in respiration are the lungs, right? Lungs are a very complex organ, and the MCAT doesn't really test too much on it because parts of it are really complex, and it's just not as something that's not very popular with the MCAT. As you can see here, there's many different things that are labeled here. Really, you don't have to know. The majority ones that you have to know is the trachea, which is kind of like which brings in air from the mouth into the lungs, right? Branches off here and here into the, obviously have two lungs. Most people have two lungs, and they should look symmetrically. They have these branches. The branches are called bronchi, right? These little branching, like tree-like things. And then at the end of these branches, right here and here and here, everywhere, there are these small, bunch of these small sacs called the alveoli. And this is like the most important part of the lungs, the alveoli. Okay. And then under the lungs, you have this big pink muscle called the diaphragm, this dome-shaped muscle. And this is extremely important. That's how we breathe, is through that muscle, the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is a muscle that is the driving force behind respiration. When the diaphragm contracts, we inhale. When it relaxes, we exhale. So if you want to breathe in, you're contracting the diaphragm. Then when you breathe out, you relax the diaphragm. When the diaphragm contracts, it pushes the rib cage out and it expands the lungs, like physically, like a balloon, it expands it. When it relaxes, the volume returns to normal. This next section will be a little bit of a throwback to the fluids section where we mentioned gas and pressure. But when you expand the lung volume and reduce the resistance, you actually decrease the pressure in the lungs, right? The atmospheric pressure in the lungs gets decreased as a result whenever you contract the diaphragm. So, and as we mentioned in the fluids lecture, gas always flows from high pressure to low pressure environments. This principle is the reason we inhale and exhale air. Inhaling is just the gas moving from the high pressure outside to the low pressure inside. Exhaling is just air moving from the high pressure inside to the low pressure outside. When the diaphragm contracts and lung volume increases, the pressure in the lungs decreases lower than that of the outside atmosphere. This creates a pressure gradient, which creates a sort of vacuum that causes the air in the environment to rush into our lungs. If you want to think of it, when you actually do like a sucking thing, like when you suck in air, your body's not actually doing anything to bring the air in. All you're doing is just making your lungs bigger. And essentially the laws of physics do the rest. You're not actually doing anything to move the air from the outside to the inside other than expand your lungs. And then naturally the air will just flow from the outside to the inside. It'll kind of like rush in and you can't really do anything about it. This is the same principle, like if you're flying in a plane or a spaceship or something, the pressure inside the plane or the spaceship is much higher than the pressure in very high in the sky or in space. So if you open the door in a plane while you're flying, or if you open the door in a spaceship while you're in space, all of the air and everything inside the carrier will just immediately get sucked out into the atmosphere. This is the exact same principle. You create a pressure gradient, and then the air just rushes in and kind of goes down its gradient from high pressure to low pressure. During exhalation, the pressure in the lungs returns to normal, which is higher than the pressure outside, and the air flows down its pressure gradient out of your lungs, right? However, with exhalation, it's a little bit different because your body can physically assist in exhaling during strenuous exercise, or when you are just forcefully breathing and you're trying to breathe in a lot and really fast. Your body actually helps. There's some muscles in your abdomen that will kind of like push the air out more, basically. That's only when you're exhaling, not when you're inhaling. But it's normally when you're just talking, breathing normally, it's also based solely on pressure gradients. Only under like high, like forceful breathing is it really like your abdomen also helps. So I mentioned these things called the alveoli. So the lungs have many different branches called the bronchi, which end in small sacs called alveoli, which hold all of the oxygen until it is passed into your blood. These alveoli have changing air pressures. So if you looked at a graph of pressure over time in the alveoli, it would look something like this, right? Oh, sorry. Look something like this, and then it would go like this, then back up, then like this, like that, right? It would be always changing. When you're trying to inhale, the alveoli have very low pressure to allow the air to come in, down its pressure gradient. When you want to exhale, the alveoli have a lot of pressure, and you want to get it out into the environment, right? Go down the pressure gradient. So inhalation, low pressure inside the lungs, exhaling, high pressure in the lungs, basically. And that goes with the alveoli as well. The air is then rapidly diffused between these alveoli and the blood in nearby capillaries which pass by them. So, like I mentioned, the alveoli are very, very small, like circular sacs, and there's a bunch of them, like a lot of them. And the capillaries are also very, very thin, and there's a lot of capillaries that kind of reaching around. Because when you have something that's very small and a lot of it, that actually creates a lot more surface area than if you just had one big tube, right? Having many small tubes is much more surface area than having one big tube. The large surface area of contact between the alveoli and the capillaries make the process of exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide very, very fast, and you can do it very efficiently. That's why you can breathe very quickly, and like the air can transport very fast. Right, and here's a diagram here on the right. As you can see, these sacs are the alveoli, and then these are like capillaries that kind of surround it, right? Okay, so moving on. Another important thing for oxygen transport in the blood. Now that the oxygen is in your blood, we want to look at this molecule called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a complex molecule which you don't need to know the structure of, I believe, but it's just a very big molecule with a lot of different parts to it. It's a complex between like protein, like actually multiple proteins, as well as involves iron as well as like a cofactor, but it's just, you don't really have to know it. Just know hemoglobin is mainly used for transporting oxygen. It's a complex molecule found only in, or mainly in red blood cells, and it acts as a carrier for oxygen and carbon dioxide. Once the blood reaches the lungs, the oxygen diffuses through the membrane and into the vessels or in the capillaries, like I mentioned. And when it does that, the oxygen binds to the hemoglobin in the blood, as oxygen has a very strong affinity for hemoglobin. Once the blood reaches its target tissue, the blood bound to the hemoglobin will unbind and go into the cell. The process of how it does this is a little bit complicated, and I don't believe they really test on it in the MCAT. If you took a biochemistry class, you probably have talked about this whole process, but for the MCAT, it's not really important because it's a little bit in depth, right? But yeah, the main idea is that hemoglobin is kind of like the carrier. If you want to think of it, it's like a taxi almost for your oxygen. It picks up the oxygen at the lungs, transports them to wherever it wants to go, the arms, legs, whatever, liver, and then it transports it there, drops off its passenger, which is the oxygen, and then goes back to the lungs through the system, like through the heart, goes back to its and picks up a new passenger. Right? Do we need to know how many Fe it binds, like a tetramer or not? So not really, no. Know that hemoglobin maybe you may need need to know that hemoglobin is kind of a tetramer. But the main thing you actually have to know about hemoglobin structure is that it has a quaternary structure. So if you remember from proteins, they have a primary structure, secondary structure, tertiary structure, and then some have a quaternary structure. Whenever anybody in any class pretty much gives an example of a quaternary structure, they pretty much always say hemoglobin, because that's the main example in your body that's everybody knows and is easy to talk about. It just means that there's multiple subunits in hemoglobin that act as a tetramer. I believe it binds one iron, but it you don't really have to know that, and the structure is way too complex, right? So don't worry about it, but just know it uses iron. Okay. So there's this binding curve, which you may have to know for hemoglobin, and there's a lot I want to cover here. So firstly, look at the y-axis. Whenever you see a graph, just on the MCAT or anywhere, you'll see a lot of graphs. And whenever you see graphs, I always suggest first thing, look at what is the y-axis, what is the x-axis. That'll tell you basically what we're measuring and what we're even looking at here. The y-axis is the hemoglobin saturation. What that means is what percentage, and you can see a percentage sign, what percentage of hemoglobin is currently bound to oxygen, right? I said that it has a high affinity, and so it'll bind to oxygen, but it's not just like instant, right? Nothing in chemistry is really like that. So it's like a gradual change, and it doesn't always get fully saturated, but this shows you, the y-axis shows you the percentage of hemoglobin that is bound to oxygen at this current moment. On the x-axis, we have this really stands for the partial pressure of oxygen, but really what that could mean, and what you should interpret it as, to make it simpler, is just the amount of oxygen that is present in like the environment or the air, right? Or in like the space, right? How much oxygen is actually there. So if you go to the right, you have more oxygen in the space with the hemoglobin. If you go to the left, you have very little oxygen in the space with the hemoglobin, right? And this is what this graph is measuring. So as you increase the amount of oxygen available, how much of the hemoglobin will be bound to oxygen? As you expect, you increase the amount of total oxygen available, more and more of the hemoglobin will be bound to oxygen, a higher percentage, right? And that makes sense. First thing you guys should look at is this normal line, which is in red. This is what it normally looks like. This is normally what a binding curve looks like for hemoglobin. An important thing I want to mention, and if you guys remember this from the Michaelis-Menten curve, right? It's very similar to Km value. It's called a P50. A P50, what that means is at what pressure or what amount of oxygen would exactly 50% of the hemoglobin be saturated or bound to oxygen. So remember that the P50 is an amount of oxygen. It's this, right? It's the quantity, the units of it are this essentially, right? And I'm going to clear my drawings, but P50, it's actually just the units of this, right? It's how much oxygen is there. That's an important thing I really want to like stress. That's why I'm saying it a couple of times. It's how much oxygen is there. It's an amount. What's special about this specific amount is this is the amount that will cause exactly half of the hemoglobin to be saturated with oxygen and half to not have oxygen, essentially, right? That's what we measure as, and just like we use Km in Michaelis-Menten kinetics to measure the affinity, we use the P50 value to measure the affinity of oxygen for hemoglobin because it changes depending on the conditions, right? So if you have a low P50 value, that means you need very little oxygen in order to saturate a lot of hemoglobin, meaning high affinity. If you have a high P50 value, that means you need a lot of oxygen in order to saturate the same amount of hemoglobin, meaning you have a low affinity. Okay, low P50, high affinity, high P50, low affinity. Low P50, high affinity, high P50, low affinity. Okay. Now, moving on from that, I now want to mention this green line and this blue line called the right shift, left shift. The reason it's called the right shift, because if you took this red line and you moved it to the right, you would have the green line. Left shift, you took the red line, the normal, you moved it to the left, you have the blue line. That's why it's called the right shift, left shift. The right shift would have a higher P50 value, right? That's the main thing. So if the P50 is on this line, right? So this is 50% saturation. So if you went here, and now you went down, so now you see the P50, which I said in units is amount of this, right? This is the units. Now it's higher, say it's 54, right? Just as an example. So now, in order to saturate the same amount of hemoglobin, you need twice as much oxygen available. That means it's half, the affinity is halved essentially. Left shift is the opposite. The P50 is over here. So the P50 is over here, say it's 15. Now you only need half as much oxygen, therefore the affinity is twice as high, right? Hopefully that makes sense. Right shifting, just remember right shifting is always shifting the graph physically to the right, which increases the P50 and lowers the affinity. Right shift is lowering affinity, left shift is increasing affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen. Okay. Now, under what conditions will a right shift or a left shift occur? Right shift, mainly, at least for MCAT purposes, right shift will occur in high acidic environments. So low pH or high H+ means acidic. In the body, the main acid that you have in the body, and I'll talk about this actually in a second, the main acid that you have present throughout the body is actually CO2, is actually carbon dioxide. That's the main acid that you have in your body. So having a lot of carbon dioxide in your body will actually decrease the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen, and it will make the whole body, it will make your pH more acidic, right? On the other hand, if you decrease the pH, or if you decrease the acidity, or increase the pH, make it more basic, you'll have a left shift. You'll increase the affinity, right? Other ways are temperature, obviously, but you don't really have to, it's not as important, but temperature, right? To heat something, less affinity. To cool it, a little more affinity. But this one, DPG, this may come up. I very much doubt it will. If you took a biochemistry class, you probably have talked about DPG, but I very much doubt you'll see it on the MCAT. It's a molecule that is present specifically in people who live at high altitudes and people who have adapted to live in high altitudes. They will have this molecule like DPG. They'll have like they would have evolved to have more of this, and it's for specific reason because the air up there is thinner. But really, you don't have to go into that. But if you are curious, look into it more on your own. But I would not, I'm not stressing it too much, right? And these are not important. These are not really important. These are not really that important either. At least for the MCAT purposes. In real life, they're obviously very important, but for the MCAT purposes, they're not.
Mark, the DPG stand for the diphosphoglycerate. Is that?
I believe so, but I actually don't remember what it stands for. But it's a molecule that's that. What I remember is it's a molecule that's present in people who live at high altitudes where the air is thinner, and it's used for. It's specifically used because if you didn't have it, it would be very, very difficult for you to get oxygen saturation in your cells specifically at high altitudes. That's why people who are not adapted in such a way, like if you tried to climb Mount Everest, it would be very difficult for you compared to somebody who normally lives at high altitudes. Okay, so do want to mention that by increasing the affinity of oxygen to hemoglobin, yes, it becomes easier for the oxygen in your lungs to go into your blood, but it also decreases the oxygen unloading, which is actually getting the oxygen to your cells, right? Because if the oxygen is very, very high affinity for your hemoglobin in your blood, when it reaches the cells and it's time for it to get off, it won't get off because it'll just stay on. So it might be harder to unload it. So if you have too high of an affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen, then you may have problems getting oxygen to your cells. You'll have a lot of oxygen in your blood, but not a lot in your cells, right? And that's a common problem that some people have who have like blood disorders. Okay, and right, and then obviously if you have too much of a right shift, then it'll be difficult to get the oxygen from your lungs into your blood, which it will also eventually get in. Yeah. Yeah, left shift is a more basic environment, yeah. And so last thing I want to touch on before we get onto the clicker questions is lungs for pH regulation. So along with the kidneys, which are also an important pH regulator in the body, the lungs are the other main pH regulator in the body. This is because one of the main sources of acidity in our body is CO2. So if you guys remember from acids and bases, CO2 is not inherently acidic, right? It's not inherently a Lewis acid or a Bronsted, whatever, Lowry acid. But in our bodies, CO2 reacts with water to produce this, H2CO3, right, which I actually mentioned earlier is carbonic acid, right? This is also an acid, right? And this is made through CO2. So if you have a lot of CO2, by proxy, you'll have a lot of carbonic acid in your body because you always have a lot of water in your acid in your body, which will react, right? This carbonic acid is acidic. Thus, having high levels of CO2 causes our pH to lower kind of indirectly, right? And just for reference, the conjugate base of bicarbonate I already mentioned is of carbonic acid is bicarbonate, HCl3-, which is also very important for you guys to remember just about what bicarbonate is. And it's a base, obviously the conjugate base. And then obviously since the lungs are the main way to regulate the amount of CO2 in your body, it's a major pH balancer. If you're breathing a lot and heavily, you're going to be getting rid of a lot of CO2. Getting rid of a lot of acid means your pH will actually go up and you'll have your blood will be more alkaline, or your body will be more alkaline compared to normal, right? If you're breathing very poorly and you're not taking a lot of breaths, what could actually happen is acidosis, which is when acid starts to build up in your body because you're not breathing enough and not enough CO2 is being expelled, and you'll have kind of acidosis in your body, and you'll have your body pH will drop too much. Okay, and obviously both ways are bad. If you have too much alkaline or too much acidity, proteins stop working, enzymes stop working. Ideally, cells start to have problems, and it's not good. It's just not good either way, right? So actually, 100 people, 100% of people said B, and I'm happy you guys got it. Simple diffusion. I'll just go over it quickly. So osmosis, this is automatically wrong. Osmosis is only for water, right? And I want you guys to kind of like keep that in your memory, like at all times. If you're dealing with water, osmosis is the main method of transport of water. If you're not dealing with water, osmosis is automatically always wrong. So looking at the other three options, what is the mechanism of oxygen transfer from the lungs to the blood? Like I mentioned, it goes from the alveoli to the bloodstream through the membrane, to the capillaries through the membrane, right? Active transport means that you have to expend ATP, usually to go against the gradient. That's what active transport is usually used for, to go against the gradient. In this case, like I mentioned, you're going with a gradient with like oxygen. There's high oxygen in the alveoli, low oxygen in the capillaries. right? Because in the blood, it's not oxygenated blood, it's deoxygenated blood. So the blood doesn't have the oxygen yet. That's why I'll go there. So it's not active transport. Simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. The main difference between these is simple diffusion is directly across a membrane. So if you have space here and space here, and then you just have a membrane, which is a wall, and then this can directly go here, and this can directly go here with no problem. That's simple diffusion. If you had the same situation, you had a space here and space here, you had a wall. However, in facilitated diffusion, this stuff cannot go past this wall, and this stuff cannot go past this wall. You need special channels, or like membrane channel proteins or something like that, to actually facilitate the diffusion across the membrane, because it wouldn't normally be able to go through the membrane. In this case, oxygen's a fairly small molecule compared to things like sugar, proteins, and things like that. Oxygen's fairly small, so it has no problem diffusing just simply across the membrane. It does need to go through channels. Okay, so that's why when osmosis is not water, active transport is going with the gradient, not against. Facilitated diffusion doesn't use any membrane, doesn't use any channel proteins or anything like that, or carriers. So he's the right answer. And this question. Okay, so people chose choice A and C. So the correct answer actually is choice A. So which of the following occurs during expiration? So increase in lung volume will be eliminated first, because increasing the lung volume, it actually happens during inhalation or inspiration, right? When you breathe in, like I mentioned, ribs get pushed out, lungs expand. That's what causes the drop in pressure in the lungs. So it wouldn't be increase in lung volume. Actually the opposite would happen. They would deflate. Contraction of diaphragm again happens during inspiration rather than expiration. Contraction of the diaphragm causes lungs to expand, lets you breathe in. All right. However, A, increase of pressure in the lung relative to the environment. Again, increasing in lungs relative to the environment, that creates a gradient. Following air follows gradient and goes out. Okay. Contraction of external intercostal muscles. So this I didn't really cover too in depth, but these are just kind of like the other muscles in your chest, abdomen area that are also used for, mainly they're used for like forceful breathing, but they aren't really used for normal breathing, right? So that one would be the answer, and A is, out of these, A is the best answer.